first one this morning from the New Testament is from 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. But if anyone has caused pain, he has caused it not to me, but to some extent, and to exaggerate it, to all of you. This punishment by the majority is enough for such a person. So now instead you should forgive and console him, so that he may not be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. So I urge you to reaffirm your love for him. I wrote for this reason, to test you, and to know whether you are obedient in everything. Anyone whom you forgive, I also forgive. What I have forgiven, if I have forgiven anything, has been for your sake in the presence of Christ. And we do this so that we may not be outwitted by Satan, for we are not ignorant of his designs. And the gospel lesson this morning comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23, verses 33 through 38. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right, one on his left. Then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by, watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Messiah, of God his chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself. There was also an inscription over him, This is the King of the Jews. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. Thank you. Okay, now that's right. Thank you so much. Good Riddance Day. Has anyone heard of Good Riddance Day? Now, believe it or not, there is a day designated around New Year's Day sometime where people gather in Times Square in New York. Okay, that's where all the strange stuff happens, I admit. But they gather for what they call Good Riddance Day. People come there and they write down on something. Sometimes it's an old car, sometimes it's a brick, whatever they want to. They write down the things in their lives that they just want to get rid of, that it's time to be done with. And then a whole variety of fun things are provided to them, like shredders and sledgehammers and what have you. And they just beat this stuff till you can't read it anymore, till you can't resemble it anymore, so that they can get it out of their system and move on with their lives. Good Riddance Day. They want to get rid of the pain, the suffering, the anger, the bad memories, the painful things that have occurred in their lives, the grief, maybe the bad mistakes that they've made, bad relationships that they've been through, loss that they might have had during the year, financial difficulties, jobs that they weren't able to keep, long-held grudges. Any of that sound familiar? You know, those are the kind of things that we all go through, and sometimes we hang on to, and they take that sledgehammer and they beat those things out of their lives, or at least they try to. Out with the old, in with the new. Say good riddance to the past darkness in our lives and pray that we might have some light. Wouldn't that be nice? Some light. You know, God calls us not to live into the past, but we tend to do it, don't we? We tend to live in the past. We sometimes become chained to that past as if It's the thing that defines us. Does your past define you? Is that what you think? You may think that other people believe that, and maybe other people do believe that, but we are Christians, aren't we? We're not defined by our mistakes. We're not defined by our education. We're not defined by our job. We're not defined by our ability to keep good relationships around us. We're not defined by the things that our children do, good or bad. What defines us? Christ defines us. Only Christ. He's the only one that has the power. He's the only one that has the ability. He's the only one that has the right, because he created us. And so he defines us. Healing in our lives, which is kind of where Good Riddance Day is leading, or it's hoping to lead. Healing means letting go. Now, I know for an absolute fact, and I don't have to know your individual story to know this, I know for an absolute fact we all have something to let go. Don't we? We all do. And if we're going to heal, we need to let it go. The human condition, we always need forgiveness, don't we? And we always need to forgive. Both of those things are always true. We always need forgiveness, and we always have someone in our lives that we need to forgive. You did a wonderful job with 2 Corinthians 2. Thank you very much. I want to go over it again because it's the basis of this sermon today. If anyone has caused grief, he has not so much grieved me as he has grieved all of you to some extent, not to put it too severely. The punishment inflicted on him by the majority is sufficient. Now imagine just for a minute, if you will, that there is some incident in the church that Paul is responding to. Something happened in the Corinthian church, okay? And he was written a letter about this something. And, given a name probably of a person who did something terribly wrong and who was banished from the church. Thrown out. No longer allowed to attend, no longer allowed to participate in the fellowship of the church. This person did something really bad. We don't know what it was. Adultery maybe? We don't know. Blaspheming the Spirit? I don't know. Something bad. Something bad enough that the church said, you're out of here. All right? Now here is Paul's response to that letter that we don't have, to that incident that we don't know all the details about. Here's Paul's response to that. If anyone has caused grief, he has not so much grieved me as he has grieved all of you to some extent. But not to put it too severely. These are Paul's words. The punishment inflicted on him by the majority is sufficient. Now instead, you ought to forgive and comfort him so that he will not be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. I urge you, therefore, to reaffirm your love for him. Another reason I wrote you was to see if you would stand the test and be obedient in everything. Anyone you forgive, I also forgive. And what I have forgiven, if there was anything to forgive, I have forgiven in the sight of Christ for your sake, in order that Satan might not outwit us, for we are aware of his schemes. What's Paul saying? Okay, the guy did something bad. We agree with that. All right? Okay, he's been punished. He was thrown out of the fellowship. But now, Paul says, it's time to welcome him back. Why did he say to welcome him back? So that he wouldn't be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. That's something. So he's not disagreeing that there's a time for punishment. There is. But he's also saying there's a time to end that and to welcome someone back, to forgive them his words. And so, it's time to love this person. It's time to encourage this person. It's time to give them a helping hand. It's a time to stop imposing consequences, even though that may have been appropriate at first. You know, this makes me think of the story of the prodigal son. Remember the prodigal son? Prodigal son thought that he should be punished. He agreed that he should be punished. In fact, he so agreed that he should be punished that when he finally decided he needed to go home, he was just going to go home and beg his father to allow him to be a servant. That's it, just a servant. He never expected what actually happened. What actually happened? He was welcomed back as a son, wasn't he? Not as a servant. His coming back to the fold was celebrated. That's a metaphor for what Paul's talking about. Welcomed back to the fold. Welcome back as a full member of the church. Welcome back as someone who's worthy of love. Someone who's worthy of care. Time to reinstate and welcome back and forgive. It's a couple of things that are kind of hard. And the first one is that it's kind of hard to judge compassionately, isn't it? What is our temptation when we want to judge? And we all do it. We all judge. We all make judgments. We have to decide, is it okay for our child to go to that home? Will they be safe there, right? That's a judgment. We all have to make those judgments throughout our life. It's hard to judge compassionately because when we judge someone, we tend to want to judge, or we tend to judge because we're angry, we're frustrated, which is actually a kind of anger I learned, or we want retribution. And the other thing that we're called to do is to forgive. But it's hard to forgive completely. I wonder which is harder. Is it harder to judge compassionately, or is it harder to forgive completely? They both are problematic, aren't they? They're both difficult for us as human beings. But if we're to imitate Christ, if that's what we're going to do, we're going to have to judge compassionately and forgive completely. There's 5 benefits of forgiveness I want to go over very quickly. The first one comes from verses 5 and 6 in our passage. Forgiveness displays God's mercy. If anyone has caused grief, he has not so much grieved me as he has grieved all of you to some extent, not to put it too severely. The punishment inflicted on him by the majority is sufficient. Forgiveness displays God's mercy. You know, when's enough? When is enough enough? Okay? When is punishment, if you will, when is it time to end that? It's hard to know. In fact, I think parents really have a hard time with that because every child is different. You can't just make rules that are absolute, that if this infraction leads to this consequence, because our kids are all different. If you have a strong-willed child, you may have to sit on them a little harder, right? But if you have a child with a sensitive spirit, and there are those, just looking at them will be punishment enough. When they see that look in your eyes, they'll start crying because they know that what they've done is wrong, and they already feel remorse. It's hard to draw those lines with your kids as a parent. Really hard. That difference between the strong-willed child and the sensitive spirit child is something that we have probably all experienced. And it means that judgment and forgiveness come at different times. The lines are drawn in different places. I'm going to tell you about the great cookie jar debacle. Oh, yes. You see, at a very young age, I discovered that the cookie jar held amazing delights. Something that I wasn't satisfied with just one or just two. I wanted more cookies, And so my mother, knowing that this is something that I longed for, took the cookie jar and set it up on the highest shelf in the kitchen, very high. In fact, we only had one small cupboard in our kitchen at that time, countertop there, and the shelves were above it. They were open shelves. There might have been 2 or 3. But Mom put that cookie jar well out of reach of little hands. I'm an engineer. Did you know that? That's what my undergraduate degree is. Yeah, it was already coming out. I had it all figured out. Next to the cupboard was our yellow Formica table with the chrome all the way around it and the chrome legs on it that were popular in the 50s when I was growing up. And of course, around the table were chairs, and so at the age of, I'm just going to guess I was 3, maybe 3 years old, I pulled the chair over in front of the counter, and I crawled up onto the chair, and I looked. The cookie jar was still well above me, but I was closer. Oh yes, I was closer. And I climbed from the chair onto the countertop then, and I stood up, and I could actually touch the cookie jar. Now, that didn't solve the problem, because the cookie jar, well, it was about this big, it had porcelain of some kind that it was made out of, and it had a lid on top. The lid had to come off. I don't know how I got the lid off, but I managed to get the lid off. And then I had to reach up over the rim of it, down into the cookie jar to get the cookie. There was a terrible crash. It wasn't me, it was the cookie jar. The cookie jar fell to the floor and smashed into 1,000,000 pieces. I didn't count them, but that's just my guess. My mom came running. It was really clear to me, even at the age of 3, that this is probably something I wasn't going to get away with. Yeah. She had pretty well figured out what had happened with me standing on the counter and the cookie jar smashed on the floor. Now, I could have lived all these years with the shame of knowing that I broke the cookie jar, and I suppose in some ways I have. My mom, also let me know that her great-grandmother gave her that cookie jar, so I had destroyed a family heirloom of some kind. But I never doubted my whole life that my mom loved me. No. In spite of smashing the cookie jar and probably 1,000 other infractions as a child, my mom loved me. And I always knew it. She forgave me. And I always knew it. Proverbs 27:6. Wounds from a sincere friend are better than many kisses from an enemy. You know, it's kind of interesting. If somebody that you don't know that well says to you, you know, you need to clean up your act, you need to do this, you need to do that, you might just think, well, that's just criticism, right? Who are they to say anything about my life? You might just dismiss what they had to say because they have no investment in you, right? But here's the thing. If those same exact words come from somebody that you know loves you, there's no doubt in your mind that they love you, that they're invested in your life, that they care about you, that they want what's best for you. Now it's time to listen, isn't it? You got to listen because you know that they love you. That's really what Proverbs 27:6 says. If someone really, really has your best interest at heart, if someone loves you and you know it, you kind of got to listen to what they have to say. And Psalm 103:8-9, the Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love. He will not always accuse, nor will he harbor his anger forever. See, sometimes we think forgiveness is going soft on sin, right? But really, it's going big on Christ. Have you heard this thing that where the punishment fits the crime? The punishment should fit the crime, right? Heard that? What happens to us if the punishment fits the crime? What happens to us if God punishes us proportional to the crime? I don't think it's going to be very good, is it? No. In fact, it could be an eternity in a really dark place. But God doesn't do that. God extends grace. He loves us in spite of anything that we have done wrong. And that's what he asks us to do as well. Is it easy? No, not easy. Are we to do it? Yeah, we're supposed to do it. Verses 7 and 8 restores the sinner like the prodigal son that I told you about. Now instead you ought to forgive and comfort him so that he will not be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. I urge you, therefore, to reaffirm your love for him, just as the Father did for his Son when he returned home. Well, why do you do that? Why do you reaffirm the love? Well, that kind of leads us into number 3. Forgiveness demonstrates obedience. This is verse 9. Another reason I wrote you was to see if you would stand the test and be obedient in everything. Obedience. That's one of the reasons that we forgive. But is it the only reason? You know, we forgive because God asks us to forgive. And so, being obedient to that request, we forgive. But here's the main thing that's important for you to know about forgiveness. Who benefits from forgiveness? Is it the person you're forgiving? It might be a little bit once in a while, but maybe not at all. It benefits the forgiver. It benefits you. When we walk around filled with this darkness and pain that goes with being unforgiving, it affects us. It affects our relationship with Christ. We need to forgive. Not just because it's obedient, although that's a good reason, but because it's what's best for us. That's why Christ asks us to do it. He knows it's best for us. Forgiveness reflects the character of Christ. This is verse 10. Now here's the amazing thing. I want you to count with me how many times Paul says forgive in verse 10. Anyone you forgive, I also forgive, and what I have forgiven, if there was anything to forgive, I have forgiven in the sight of Christ for your sake. 5 times in one sentence, Paul says forgive. You think he believes it's important? I think he believes it's important. And our last one is forgiveness blocks Satan's evils. That's verse 11. In order that Satan might not outwit us, for we are aware of his schemes. You see, unforgiveness allows Satan to camp out in our hearts. When I say darkness, that's what I mean. Darkness. When we're not being obedient to Christ, evil invades us. It takes residence in us. And it harms us because that's the only goal of Satan, is to hurt us. That's what he wants to do. And if we give him an opening to do that, that's what he does. If God treated us the way we treat others, wow, I don't know. We need to treat others the way God treats us and turn that around. Luke 23:34, you heard this morning also. Jesus' words, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Have you heard the parable of the unforgiving servant? Unforgiving servant? Heard that parable? Do you remember it? Parable of the unforgiving servant. He goes to his master, who he owes a lot. All right? He goes to his master, he bows before his master, and he begs his master to forgive him his debt. Please, master, please, I can't possibly pay back what I owe you. Please forgive my debt. And what does the master do? Forgives him. Forgives the debt that he owes. He walks away with no burden on his shoulders because his master has, filled with grace, given him forgiveness for his debt. Now, as he walks away from the master, he meets someone on the road who owes him money or something. And the person that meets him asks him to forgive the debt that he owes him. And what does the servant do? He said, no way! You pay up or you'll pay another way. Now wait a minute. Here's a man who just had all his debt forgiven, but he